What if our understanding of vampires and werewolves was entirely mistaken? Not rooted in shadowy Gothic fortresses or remote European hamlets, but in a far more enigmatic realm. Picture an era before the pyramids, before recorded history as we understand it, when a society gazed at the stars and saw deities, peered into the darkness and glimpsed terrors. Could the earliest tales of blood-craving creatures and accursed shape-changers have emerged not in medieval Europe, but in the very cradle of humanity? Step into Sumer, where myths and dread were etched into clay millennia ago, where the horrors of our nightmares first stirred. Welcome to Tales of Mythology, where ancient legends, buried fears, and supernatural conflicts are reborn. If you're fascinated by the hidden facets of mythology, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon below to stay updated with every epic tale. Long before Dracula, before silver bullets, before howls echoed through Transylvanian woods, there was Sumer. Nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, this ancient land was more than the dawn of recorded civilization. It gave birth to writing, governance, and laws, but also to darker stories of entities trapped between life and death, spirits ravenous for blood, and humans doomed to wander as beasts. In the clay tablets of Sumerian scribes, we uncover the haunting notion of the Edimmu, restless souls of the unburied or brutally killed. These weren't mere fireside tales. They were dreaded, believed to glide through doorways like mist. The Edimmu would infiltrate homes under night's cloak, sapping their victims not with talons or teeth, but with an unseen hunger. A tablet from the British Museum, K162, portrays them as wanderers of the earth, feeding on the breath of the living. If that sounds strikingly close to our modern vampire lore, it's no coincidence. These ancient spirits consumed not flesh but vitality, draining their victims until only death remained. Worse yet, they were drawn to neglect. A person who died without proper burial or offerings was fated to become one, condemned to torment the living in eternal resentment. According to the laws of Eshnunna, neglecting burial rites wasn't merely an oversight, it was a summons for horror. Why did these beliefs grip so fiercely? In an age when dim oil lamps were the sole shield against the vast, unknown night, people feared more than just predators. Every rustle in the dark, every mysterious ailment, could signal an intrusion from another realm. In Sumer, the dead were never truly departed. Unless honored and pacified, they lingered perilously near. It's no surprise that amulets, charms, and murmured spells permeated their homes and rituals. Yet, Edimmu weren't the only terrors in the shadows. The Utaku, a wider group of spirits, prowled within Sumerian cosmology. Unlike the Edimmu, these entities could be benevolent or malevolent. Some acted as divine emissaries, others plagued the innocent with sickness and despair. The boundary between guardian and menace was perilously thin. The Utaku Lemnutu, or wicked spirits, were blamed for everything from barrenness to ruined harvests. A chant from the Exorcist's manual in the library of Ashurbanipal pleads, "O you demon that assaults humanity, you who rose from the underworld, depart, accursed one." This turmoil between realms, gods, mortals, and spirits defined the Sumerian worldview. The night wasn't merely void, it was alive with thirsting spirits and nascent monsters. Imagine the chilling stillness of a Sumerian city after doors locked, clay charms etched with protective spells hung above entrances, priests muttering invocations as oil lamps cast long, trembling shadows across mud brick walls. In this dim world, where death lingered closer than breath, the myths of blood drinkers and beast men didn't feel like fantasy. They were warnings. And here we see the roots, deep, ancient, and terrifying, of the vampire myth. Not in velvet cloaks or silver crosses, but in clay incantations and crude drawings scratched by trembling hands into wet earth. These weren't characters, they were threats. As historian and Assyriologist Jeremy Black noted in Gods, Demons, and Symbols of Ancient Mesopotamia, 1992, the Sumerians did not distinguish sharply between the natural and the supernatural. To them, illness, death, and fortune were all subject to powers beyond the veil. Spirits were not metaphors, they were explanations. And what of the dead who walk among us? What of the cursed souls who drink not just blood, but being itself? In the heart of Sumer, the line between the living and the dead was never truly defined. It was a civilization where the night belonged to things that whispered in forgotten tongues, and where silence itself was a sign of something watching. Among the most feared of these presences were the Edimmu, spirits of those denied proper burial or violently killed. But these beings were not simply ghosts. They were parasites of the soul, draining vitality, disturbing families, and spreading sickness without warning. Their existence lingered in the spaces between shadow and breath, waiting for a weakness. Ancient texts from Nippur and Lagash describe them as those who have not passed into Kur, the underworld, and their hunger was unrelenting. These spirits, trapped between realms, were described not just as phantoms, but as entities with a purpose. The Edimmu sought what had been denied to them in death, peace, memory, and offering. Without ritual libations or funerary feasts to guide them to the underworld, they clung to the living world, feeding off its essence. Their presence brought more than fear, it invited a kind of spiritual rot. A household plagued by misfortune, where members fell ill or crops withered without reason, was often said to be under the grip of an Edimmu. And the remedy wasn't simply prayer, it was action. Exorcists, known as ashipu, were called upon to diagnose the source of the disturbance and to chant complex incantations to drive the restless soul back to the domain of the dead. What made the Edimmu so terrifying was their invisibility. Unlike beasts of flesh, they couldn't be seen, only felt. Tablets recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal reveal how the presence of these spirits was often identified by symptoms: sudden fever, disorientation, emotional imbalance, or inexplicable dread. Victims would grow pale, lose energy, and in some accounts, claim to see shadowy figures watching them in their dreams. One ritual text, known as Maklu, contains lines such as, "You eater of breath, be gone from this house. Let your hunger return to the dust from which you came." These incantations weren't symbolic, they were weapons against what the ancients believed to be a spiritual predator. But the Edimmu were not the only beings to stalk the fragile border between life and death. Among their spiritual kin were the Utaku, demons whose moral alignment was uncertain. Unlike the Edimmu, who were created by misfortune, the Utaku were ancient forces existing before mankind. Some served gods, others tormented mortals. The Utaku Lemnutu, the evil ones, could bring disease, madness, and destruction. Texts from Eridu depict entire villages performing purifying rituals to dispel the presence of these demons, sometimes involving animal sacrifice, burning incense, or complex water rites. In their world, spiritual contamination could be as deadly as a physical wound. And healing required knowledge passed through generations of priests. Rituals of purification often included offerings not just to drive away the malicious spirit, but to appease others that might be drawn to the scene. The Sumerians believed that spiritual imbalance could attract more than one entity. In this way, their world was a tightly wound web of action and consequence, where every death, especially unnatural ones, had a potential ripple effect on the community. The Edimmu and Utaku were considered symptoms of cosmic disorder, signs that the veil between realms had thinned. And when this happened, the night was no longer safe. Doors were sealed, chants were whispered into oil lamps, and protective amulets made of copper or lapis lazuli were hung over thresholds to repel the hungry dead. One of the most unsettling beliefs surrounding the Edimmu was their preference for vulnerability. They were said to be drawn to children, to the sick, to women in childbirth, moments where life stood on the edge, where the body was weak and the soul exposed. In some incantations, scribes detail how the spirit crawls into the lungs or sits upon the chest like a beast, suffocating slowly. These descriptions, remarkably close to modern accounts of sleep paralysis, were not psychological theories to the Sumerians. They were reality, interpreted through a spiritual lens. An excerpt from the Udug series reads, "You who breathe fear into the nostrils of men, who drinks the milk of their joy, depart this place." Here, emotion itself was seen as sustenance for these beings, misery as their wine, fear as their bread. The emotional weight of these beliefs shaped the very architecture of Sumerian society. Houses were built with sanctified clay, and burial rituals were carefully structured to prevent spiritual pollution. It was not uncommon for multiple generations to live under one roof, in part so the dead could be honored properly through continuous rites. If a spirit was forgotten, if a name was no longer spoken, it could become enraged. The most dangerous Edimmu, according to the texts, were those who had faded from memory entirely, unclaimed, unloved, unremembered. In their grief and bitterness, they lashed out at the world that had erased them. In his work Before the Muses, 1992, Benjamin R. Foster observes, "The Sumerians lived in a world where death was not the end, but a negotiation. What followed was dependent on ritual, memory, and spiritual balance. To forget the dead was not just impolite, it was dangerous." This idea of memory as protection, of forgetfulness as peril, echoes hauntingly in the myths that would follow. It is no coincidence that the earliest tales of vampirism involve not just blood, but loss, a creature forgotten in death, seeking to be remembered through suffering. Among the dim-lit streets of ancient Sumer, fear did not only stem from spirits of the dead. There were darker tales whispered by oil lamp glow of beings not bound by death, but by transformation. In a land where gods walked among mortals and the wilderness began just beyond the city's walls, the idea of becoming something less, or more, than human haunted the collective imagination. The myth of Lamashtu, a demoness of chaos, disease, and the wild, stands at the center of this transformation. Though not a werewolf in the modern sense, her monstrous figure planted the earliest seeds of lycanthropy, a terrifying fusion of woman, beast, and spiritual corruption that shattered the barrier between civilization and savagery. Lamashtu was not born from myth alone. The Sumerians inscribed her name in exorcism tablets and protective amulets, desperate to ward off her hunger. She was said to be the daughter of Anu, the sky god, and unlike most demons, she acted independently of divine command. Her iconography was grotesque, often depicted with the head of a lioness, the body of a woman, taloned feet, and wings of a predatory bird. She carried serpents in each hand, and her presence meant only suffering. Her domain was the liminal space, forests, swamps, open fields, places where human life gave way to the unknown. She was especially feared for preying on pregnant women and newborns, slipping silently into homes to steal life before it had even begun. The transformation associated with Lamashtu was not a gift, but a curse. Unlike the gods who could shift shape with divine ease, those touched by Lamashtu or her kin suffered a spiritual degradation. The human soul under her influence could become animal-like, savage, uncontrollable, and beyond redemption. In this lies the earliest Sumerian expression of metamorphosis as punishment. Ritual texts describe how men who committed grave offenses or were spiritually impure could be marked by wildness, cursed to wander the steppe like beasts, estranged from their communities. This transformation was not necessarily physical, but a complete loss of identity. The afflicted would behave like animals, shun human contact, and be feared by their own people. Though the Sumerians didn't write of werewolves as later European traditions would, the framework of the myth was already forming. Their tales held the belief that a person could be overtaken by animal instincts, not just symbolically, but as a manifestation of divine punishment or demonic influence. The wild, to the Sumerian mind, was not merely a location, it was a state of being. To lose oneself to the wild was to fall from order in. It is within this belief that the concept of lycanthropy as banishment from humanity was born. Stories told of people howling at the edges of fields, crawling on all fours, no longer speaking, no longer remembering who they were. One of the clearest precursors to the werewolf myth in Sumerian lore is found in the tale of Ishtar, goddess of love, war, and fate, and her infamous wrath. When rejected by mortal lovers, her vengeance was swift and unrelenting. In one ancient story, she cursed a shepherd who had once pleased her but then lost her favor. As punishment, she transformed him into a wolf. This was no metaphor. The transformation stripped him of his humanity entirely. His flocks turned on him, his dogs hunted him, and his community cast him out in fear. The curse condemned him to the wilderness, to be feared and forgotten. This myth, recorded on tablets such as Tablet 6 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, predates later stories of lycanthropy by millennia and reveals the mythic foundation for shape-shifting as both divine judgment and spiritual exile. This theme of the divine inflicting animal form as punishment was repeated across multiple texts and cities. The transformation into a beast was always symbolic of something more profound, the loss of reason, the collapse of identity, and the descent into instinct. Unlike gods who shifted shape and retained wisdom, mortals who transformed were seen as being consumed by their new form. In the Sumerian worldview, this wasn't merely a biological shift, it was a spiritual fall. Once marked by such a fate, few returned to their former selves. The wilderness claimed them. They became legend, dangerous, forgotten, cursed. In gods, demons, and symbols of ancient Mesopotamia, Black and Green explain, to be cast into the wilderness in animal form was more than exile. It was the divine expression of disorder imposed upon a soul. This underlines a key Sumerian belief: transformation was not a path to power, but a descent into chaos. It was feared, not admired, and those who suffered it were both pitied and reviled. Their stories served as warnings: defy the gods, abandon ritual, and you may lose not just your place in society, but your very form, your name, your memory. The wolf watches from the trees. He was once a man. He spoke with words. Now he speaks with hunger. The gods do not hear him. His name is Wind. From Lamashtu's grip on motherhood to Ishtar's divine wrath turning man into beast, Sumerian myth wove a tapestry of terror built upon transformation. But the transformation itself was never beautiful. It was exile. It was spiritual annihilation. And as the moon rose over the plains of Mesopotamia, the Sumerians whispered not only of spirits, but of those who once walked as men and returned to crawl as beasts. In the symbolic landscape of Sumer, two elements stood out with chilling prominence: blood and the moon. Both were deeply revered, feared, and associated with divine cycles and supernatural events. The moon, with its shifting phases, was more than a celestial object. It was the guardian of mysteries, of night terrors, of birth and death. Blood, meanwhile, was life made visible, the very essence of the soul. Together, they formed a powerful duo in the Sumerian imagination, often linked to moments when the human and spiritual worlds collided violently. It was within these associations that some of the earliest foundations for myths of blood drinkers and shapeshifters were laid, not as isolated beings, but as part of a cosmic rhythm governed by the divine. The moon was not simply watched by the Sumerians, it was interpreted. Its waxing and waning represented the divine pulse of the universe, a sacred calendar by which rituals were scheduled and omens were read. During full moons, the night was believed to throb with spiritual energy. It was then, according to preserved incantations and ritual directives, that the veil between worlds was thinnest. Dangerous spirits, especially those untethered from proper burial, were said to be drawn to its pale light. The howls of wolves echoing across the plains during such nights were not taken as coincidence. In texts from Ur and Sipar, the nocturnal behavior of wolves was often interpreted as a sign of spiritual activity, a reaction to the moon's influence. Their cries were believed to be acknowledgments or warnings, a dialogue between beasts and the forces that shaped the cosmos. Blood, in turn, was revered with equal weight. To the Sumerians, it was not merely a physical fluid, but the visible form of one's Z, the soul breath that connected mortals to the divine. Blood spilled in violence, whether in murder, war, or sacrifice, carried profound consequences. If shed in anger or without ritual sanction, it could disrupt the spiritual balance and attract malevolent entities. Offerings involving blood were made carefully, and the misuse of such a substance could call down curses. In the temple rituals of Nippur, for instance, the blood of sacrificial animals was used to purify altars, but was also surrounded by complex prayers to prevent contamination. The idea that blood could call spirits to the living world was deeply rooted in their cosmology. This sacred danger became even more apparent during lunar eclipses, when the moon darkened and turned red, a phenomenon now understood scientifically but, at the time, interpreted through spiritual symbolism. It was believed that the moon was bleeding. This event was seen as a cosmic signal, a warning that divine conflict or imbalance was at hand. During such nights, priests performed urgent protective rites, pouring libations and reciting chants to preserve their communities. One tablet from the city of Mari reads, "When the moon turns to blood, the gates of Kur open, the hungry dead shall walk, the beasts shall speak, and the breathless shall seek warmth." The moon's red hue was not poetic, it was a cry of war between order and chaos. The connection between blood and spiritual corruption extended to the body itself. The Sumerians observed the synchronicity between the lunar cycle and menstruation, particularly in women. This connection made the moon a symbol not only of mystery but of life and fertility. However, as with all powerful forces in Sumerian thought, this too had a darker edge. Menstrual blood, while symbolizing the potential for creation, was also feared for its connection to spiritual impurity. Mishandling it or failing to protect oneself ritually was thought to invite illness or spiritual invasion. The duality of blood, its power to both give life and attract death, was a constant tension, reflected in the behavior of gods and demons alike. Rituals surrounding blood were designed not only to honor but to guard. When a person died violently, it was imperative that their blood be addressed correctly. If not, it was believed that their soul could remain attached to the scene of their death, drawn repeatedly to the place where life was lost. These spirits, having tasted the trauma of a torn life, were especially dangerous. They could return not just as Edimmu, but as creatures with a craving for the vitality they had lost, an early mythic shape echoing what we now call vampires. In particular, texts recovered from the temple library at Lagash suggest that blood spilled unjustly had the power to transform the victim into a cursed spirit, one who required ritual exorcism to be sent to Kur. In Mesopotamian magic, textual, historical, and interpretative perspectives, T. Abush notes, blood acts in Mesopotamian ritual as both a vessel and a signal. It binds spirits, consecrates space, and if misused, can call what should not be named. The dangers weren't merely imagined. For the Sumerians, improperly handled blood could literally curse a house. Rooms where blood had been spilled were purified with ash, salt, and smoke. Crafted by the gods as a counterbalance to Gilgamesh's unchecked power, Enkidu emerges from the wilderness clothed in hair, hunting with beasts, drinking from rivers, and communicating not with language but with instinct. His story is a mythic memory of what it means to teeter on the edge between the human and the beast. And within his tale lies a foundational seed of the werewolf myth. Though no transformation takes place, the idea of reclaiming humanity from savagery becomes a central terror. Enkidu's existence is initially one of pure animality. The gods shaped him from clay, yet placed him far from cities, far from the influence of human customs. He lives among gazelles, protects them from hunters, and roams without shame or speech. This life changes only when he is lured from his wild state through an encounter with Shamhat, a temple priestess. Over several days, she teaches him what it means to be human, not through weapons or commands, but through intimacy, speech, food, and ritual. The moment he returns to the wilderness, the animals flee him. They no longer recognize him. In that instant, Enkidu becomes other to the world that once embraced him. This loss, while subtle in the text, mirrors the sorrow of transformation seen in later lycanthropic legends, the curse of not belonging either to man or beast, forever divided by experience. But Enkidu's wild past is never forgotten. Even as he journeys with Gilgamesh, battles monsters, and shares in human rituals, the memory of the forest lingers like a scar. His instincts remain sharp, his rage formidable, and his body a vessel of both brute strength and quiet sorrow. When they slay Humbaba, the guardian of the cedar forest, Enkidu's ferocity is unrestrained. His hands know violence before thought. The gods, displeased with this act, mark Enkidu for death. It is not Gilgamesh who falls, though he struck the final blow, but the one whose wildness never truly left him. This judgment suggests that, in the Sumerian worldview, to exist between two states, neither fully man nor beast, is to violate cosmic balance. Enkidu's death is a restoration, a reminder that liminality must be punished. The portrayal of Enkidu challenges the Sumerian conception of identity. In a society bound by ritual, order, and social role, his presence is an anomaly. He is both revered and feared, loved and doomed. There are echoes here of later figures who are caught between worlds, like the werewolf who becomes a monster when the full moon rises, yet suffers as a human in the light of day. The Sumerians may not have told stories of men physically shifting shape, but they understood deeply the terror of internal transformation. Enkidu's arc is not about a literal change of form, but of soul. And this shift, unwilled, yet irreversible, resonates with the archetype of the cursed man. Scholars such as Andrew R. George, in his critical edition of the Epic of Gilgamesh, have emphasized how Enkidu's role as a liminal figure represents the duality at the core of Mesopotamian myth. George writes, Enkidu embodies a past that civilization has tried to forget but cannot abandon. His story is not one of ascent, but of disconnection. This notion of disconnection from nature, from the divine, and from oneself lies at the very heart of ancient transformation myths. What is more horrifying than to be alienated from all worlds? Unable to return to what you once were, yet never fully accepted as what you have become. After Enkidu's death, Gilgamesh's grief is immense and raw. He holds the body for days, refusing to let go, hoping in vain for a return that will never come. The pain is not only that of losing a friend, but of witnessing the fragility of humanity. Enkidu, in dying, reminds Gilgamesh, and through him all of Sumer, that no strength, no divine favor, no companionship can escape fate. But more than that, Enkidu's death marks the final severing of his link to the wild. The transformation is complete. The beast is gone, and the man mourned, rotting, loved, is buried. Civilization reclaims him, but only in death. In the quiet corridors of ancient temples, priests once pressed sharpened reeds into wet clay, encoding fears that would survive millennia. Those fears, of spirits that fed on breath, of cursed bodies that turned wild, of blood that called the dead, never truly vanished. They transformed. As myths migrated across time and civilizations, the essence of Sumer's supernatural terrors endured, morphing into the creatures that populate our darkest tales today. Vampires and werewolves, as we recognize them, may wear modern masks. But their bones were shaped in the dust of Eridu and Lagash. These monsters are not inventions of medieval Europe or Victorian imagination. They are ancestral memories, fossilized in myth, waiting to be reawakened. The journey of these myths from Sumer to our present culture is not a simple case of transmission. It is an act of reconfiguration, as each culture absorbed Sumerian stories through Akkadian, Assyrian, Babylonian, and later Greek and Roman traditions. The symbols remained intact, even as names and details changed. The Edimmu became lemurs and revenants. Lamashtu's attributes fused with Lilith in Hebrew lore. The cursed shepherd transformed by Ishtar echoed through Greco-Roman tales of men turned into beasts by divine wrath. Even in early Christian demonology, the idea of beings trapped between life and death retained features eerily similar to those inscribed in Sumerian incantations. The emotional core never shifted. These were stories about what happens when the sacred balance is broken, when death is denied, when identity is lost, when the body becomes something unrecognizable. This continuity speaks not only to literary transmission, but to something far more fundamental: the shared psychological architecture of humanity. In Myths from Mesopotamia, Stephanie Daly notes, Mesopotamian myth reflects not only the cosmology of its time, but also a profound awareness of human vulnerability. This vulnerability, the fragile space between order and chaos, is what gives these stories their enduring power. Vampires, with their insatiable hunger for life, embody the fear of death denied. Werewolves, with their loss of control and exile from community, reflect the fear of becoming something other than oneself. These are not merely horror tropes. They are expressions of spiritual crises first articulated by a civilization that measured time with starlight and wrote their dread into clay. It is also important to recognize that, for the Sumerians, myth was not fiction. It was a system of survival, a way to map the invisible forces that govern daily life. Their beliefs were encoded into every aspect of their existence, from architecture and burial customs to agriculture and law. The presence of protective amulets, the role of the Ashipu priest, and the urgency of funerary rites all point to a worldview in which the boundary between this life and the next was perilously thin. Violating these rituals, burying the dead improperly, spilling blood without purification, ignoring lunar omens, invited disaster. And when disaster came, it was not seen as random. It was punishment, imbalance, haunting. Even now, long after the ziggurats crumbled and the gods of Sumer fell silent, these ritual echoes linger. Modern horror films, novels, and television shows continue to draw upon the same themes: the danger of forgotten spirits, the beast within man, the blood that binds and curses. We fear the dark, not because it hides nothing, but because it hides something ancient. In this sense, our vampires and werewolves are cultural palimpsests, new skins stretched over very old bones. They are not foreign to us. They are familiar, buried in the collective unconscious, passed down through tales that have long outlived their original tellers. This inheritance reminds us that myth is not a relic of the past, but a living, evolving reflection of our deepest anxieties and desires. When we read of the Edimmu creeping into homes at night, or of a man hunted by his own kin after turning into a wolf, we are not merely witnessing the fears of an ancient people. We are meeting our own, in a language that predates words. These myths endure not because they are told, but because they are felt. They resonate in the body, in the mind, in that liminal space between what we are and what we fear we could become.